friends. Uncle Marv here with another episode of my Unhealthy Podcast, a show where we try to talk about living healthy and being happy. But I do it in a little bit of a different way. I look at the things that are unhealthy, whether they are habits and behaviors, and we figure out ways to modify them, eliminate them, and transform those unhealthy habits into something that is much better for our lives. Changing habits can be challenging, but it is possible with the right approach and mindset. We will do things like exploring all the science behind building good habits and breaking bad ones. We'll talk to friends and professionals on how everybody should be able to quit the unhealthy ones, but this is a journey, and I'm going to be a little open and honest with my journey and how things are going. I've done that a couple of episodes ago. I don't have anything new to report because I haven't done anything new. The weight that I lost is still off, so all is good. I've got something a little different for this show. I know that the last two episodes we started down the relationship path, but I'm going to take us back a little bit. I started this journey actually more than a year ago. And I had a friend on that show that I recorded that you can't find on the internet anymore. But I wanted to introduce you to my friend Elikqitie. And Elikqitie is host of the Travel Gluten Free Podcast. She is a gluten-free expert, and she shares her experiences and tips on how to travel safely and healthy while avoiding gluten. And a lot of this came about because I thought being gluten-free was just kind of a fad or something that snooty people did. Turns out, no. This is really something that is real based on the celiac disease, which Elikqitie has, and her daughter, Aaliyah, also has celiac disease. So I talked to her because, listen, I don't have to be gluten-free, but I can learn how to be healthier from somebody that has to live that way. So I'm going to share with you the interviews that I did with her. This is actually going to be a two-part series. I'm going to give you part one today, and then probably in a week or so, we'll come back with part two. And then actually, there will be a part three where Elikqitie will come back and give us an update on how she has been. And the reason I'm doing that is because the episodes that I'm sharing now are actually recorded from a year ago. So we'll get an update on her, talk about her. I think she wrote another book. She wrote one book called The Guide to Traveling Gluten Free. She was doing some other stuff, so we'll get her updates on that. In the meantime, you can find her podcast. Again, it's called the Travel Gluten Free Podcast, and it is on several of the platforms out there. You just simply do a search for Travel Gluten Free or look in the show notes, and I'll have a link to it for you. Well, without a further ado, let me go ahead and get this rolling, and I bring you part one of my interview with my friend Elikqitie. I am here joined by my good friend Elikqitie, and we are going to talk about a topic that I really don't know much about, but she does, and it is a big health thing that we need to deal with if we have a particular type of disease. So Elikqitie is in the house. Elikqitie, how are you?
Hey, Marv. How's it going?
It's going pretty good. Pretty good. So I should do a proper intro and let everybody know that you have a podcast, which is how we met, and it is called Travel Gluten Free.
Yes.
And I didn't start listening to your podcast because I have a gluten problem, but I found you when I was doing all of my research of podcasters and people that have great shows. Your name came up when I was talking with some other podcasters, and then we met at PodFest, which is a conference for podcasters. And I like what you're doing, and your topic falls right in line with my new show.
Awesome. I'm so excited to be here on your new show, and thanks for having me. This is exciting.
All right. So why don't we start off with the term gluten? It's something that a lot of people don't understand, including me, before you enlightened me. So why don't we start off with that and tell us, what does it really mean to be gluten-free?
Yeah. So gluten is a macronutrient. And basically what that means is there's three macronutrients. There's fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. And so proteins and carbohydrates give you 4 calories per gram of macronutrient. I think it's gram. Anyway, and then there are fats, which gives you 9 calories. So, and that's why things that are high in fat also are high in calories, because that macronutrient, it takes your body more energy to burn fat. But gluten is actually a protein, and gluten is a protein that is found in wheat, triticale, barley, spelt, and a few other different grains. And so, to be gluten-free means that you don't eat anything that has the gluten protein in it, but it's not just bread and pasta. It actually extends to a lot of other foods, because in the past few years, manufacturers have figured out a really easy and cheap way to take gluten and liquefy it to make it a thickener. And so there's lots of other things you can't eat besides like bread and pasta that has gluten in it. And of course, there's like gluten-free varieties of foods, but we can go into that later if you want. But basically, you're not eating any food that contains the gluten protein in it. And it's not just wheat. It's wheat, barley, spelt, rye, and any of the other grains that contain gluten.
So when I first heard about this and trying to understand, this doesn't sound like something that we would have worried about years and years ago. I mean, wheat and grain and bread have been around forever. And to me, it almost seems like this is a new problem, but is it?
It actually isn't brand new. So they found out about celiac disease, which is the autoimmune disease that I have. And that's when you have celiac disease, if you eat gluten, your body actually attacks your small intestine and can scar it and can cause like really bad cancers in your digestive tract. And so, they actually figured this out in the 30s. But it hasn't really become a problem until the past 10, 20 years. And the reason is because, back in the day, like the wheat your grandmother ate is not the same wheat we eat today. So we've hybridized and genetically modified our wheat so much that the wheat we eat today contains, 20 times more gluten in it than the wheat that we used to eat like 50, 60, 70 years ago. And so that is not like a natural food for our body, and that's not a natural amount of a protein to digest. And so with celiac disease and other autoimmune diseases, you could have the gene your entire life and never come down with the disease. You have to have something that triggers it. And so eating wheat like that, or eating things that have high amounts of gluten in it that aren't natural for our body to do, can trigger having celiac disease. Also like stressful life events and other things. So you have to have a combination of like the genetics and the environmental triggers in order for an autoimmune disease to turn on.
So this sounds like similar situations where sugar wasn't a huge part of our diet before, I don't know, the 60s or 70s. And when we started, finding everything in sugar and all the glucose stuff. And it seems as though, I don't want to say the government, but food manufacturers are like causing a lot of these issues.
Oh, yeah. So back in the 80s, I don't know, you probably remember this. There was like the whole like, oh, fat is bad for you thing, right?
Yep.
And that was actually, that campaign was actually funded by the big sugar companies, because they wanted like everybody to think like fat was bad. And of course, like eating too much fat, or like depending on the type of fat you eat, can be bad for you. And, you also have to listen to your body and all that stuff. But yeah, sugar, like hands down, is the worst thing, especially white sugar. White sugar is the worst. And I was actually talking to somebody the other day, and I was like, hey, do you remember baseball players growing up? You never saw a bunch of fat baseball players like in the 70s and 80s. And now like half the team looks like they could need a diet. Like it's because of and sugar is in everything. So if you ever go on a sugar-free diet and you're label reading, you will realize how much sugar is in our food. It's crazy.
Well, you may not have heard the episode where I talked about my origin story, but, I was an athlete all my life, and, runner, football, basketball. and probably didn't experience a lot of the stuff that I did when I finally retired a few years ago. Now, I'm older now and not being as active, and all of a sudden I put on a lot of weight. Now, not a lot by most standards. I'm not, morbidly obese. I'm not, 300 pounds, but for me, I was bigger than I wanted to be. And so I did all the simple things. Smaller meals, more water, cut out the sugar, and I cut out a lot of sugar. No more soda, soda drinks. Although I did kind of, I've cheated. I've gone back. I only get the really small bottles now. I don't get the big 20 ounces anymore, and stuff like that. But that made a huge difference in cutting out that sugar. Now, my situation is, not critical to some, compared to a lot of other people, but your situation, being diagnosed with celiac, that's much more of a health concern. So tell us about your journey being diagnosed and what that meant for you.
Yeah. So just kind of going back to sugar for a second, sugar actually creates a lot of inflammation in your body. So if you have any type of health condition, cutting out sugar is always a good decision, especially if you're diabetic, you completely need to cut out sugar. And one of the things I notice is the only time I lose weight is when I cut sugar out of my diet. And the second I start eating sugar on a regular basis, my weight goes right back up. It's crazy. So for my journey, I found out I was gluten free because I was on this diet for adrenal fatigue. So if you don't know what adrenal fatigue is, it's a condition where when you undergo large amounts of stress for a long period of time, your adrenals kind of peter out and you're really tired all the time. And so I was on an adrenal fatigue diet, which was no sugar, and you eliminate a lot of the allergens. Gluten was one of them. And so I eliminated all the allergens, including gluten. And every time I added gluten back in my diet, I was horribly sick. And then I started getting tested for celiac disease. And even though they didn't test me correctly, I kept showing up on the scale. And so I haven't gotten, the way you confirm celiac disease is with a small intestine. They put a scope into your small intestine and they take a sample of your tissue. And I've never gotten the confirmation test, but I have every other symptom of celiac disease, like low pancreas function and really dry skin. And I have a scalp condition that's associated with celiac disease. And I have joint pain that's associated with celiac disease. And the list goes on and on. I won't bore you with the whole list. But even though I've never had that diagnostic test where they take your small intestine and observe it under a microscope, I have pretty much every symptom and side effect you could get from celiac disease. If I eat something with gluten in it, I know within 15 minutes, my stomach will start to feel sick within 15 minutes before I even leave the restaurant.
Now, how serious is that? Because it sounds to me like it's, annoying, aggravating, debilitating to some degree. But is it something where if you eat gluten, are you down for days?
Yeah. So it's all of the above. It's annoying. It's debilitating. It's a PIA. Fill in that whole list. It is. And it's really challenging because I love to travel, clearly, because I have a podcast about travel. So just to give you an example, I was at an air show recently called Oshkosh, and they had they have all these restaurants, and there's a difference between being gluten intolerant, which means your body just doesn't digest gluten well, and being celiac, because when you're celiac, you have a much higher sensitivity and you get much more sicker. So for example, when I get sick, if I accidentally eat gluten, because I never ever cheat with celiac disease, because with celiac disease, it's actually an autoimmune disease. It's actually cumulative. So if I cheated once a week, it wouldn't just be the next day I would be fine. That one cheat would take my body 2 to 3 months to recover. And then once you finally recover, then you're back down to you're never really back down to normal, a normal level of inflammation. So you really have to be very careful with your diet. And even with me being very careful with my diet, I still get accidentally cross-contaminated. And what that means is so for example, going back to that airplane festival, there was a restaurant there and they had all these gluten-free things marked. And I went up to them and I asked them, because they have to make sure the surface is clean. They have to change their gloves. They have to use a new knife and a new whatever, because even if they take a knife that's been cut through regular bread and they, use it on my food, I'll get really sick. And so, I asked them about the tacos. They said they can make this gluten free. They said they would change their gloves and do all the things they needed to do to make it safe. I got the order, and I always double check when I get the order. I said, you made this gluten free? Like, you changed your gloves? And the girl rolled her eyes and said, yes. And I was like, wow, that eye rolling is not really a good sign. I'm like, but I explained it to her. She understood what I was talking about. She says they make food for people with celiac disease, so it should be safe. I thought maybe she just had a rough day because they were at the air show. It was super busy. So anyway, I ate the tacos. My joints hurt. So it was clearly cross-contamination. My joints hurt so bad that night. I was like crying myself to sleep. Like, that's how bad it was. So, and I had to walk like 2 miles back to my campsite.
Wow.
It was not fun. Yeah. So I get anywhere from like debilitating joint pain all the way to like, a cross between the flu and food poisoning. So where you're literally like, I literally just put a bunch of towels down in the bathroom and sit in the bathroom for 6 hours and never leave the bathroom. Like, and that's just the start. And then you're sick for like 7 to 10 days after that.
Wow.
So it really is debilitating. It's not just like some people say like, oh, you just get a stomach ache. No, it's not. If it was just a stomach ache, I wouldn't be making a whole podcast about it. Let me tell you that right now. And of course, when you're traveling, when you get sick, when you're traveling, it really stinks because I mean, I bring all of my stuff with me, but you're still not at home. You're not in your, SH, you know what I mean? And you just you feel like you're going to die. You know, you're not going to die, but you feel like you're going to die. And this is your vacation. And so it is really hard to do because like a lot of times if people don't understand, I've walked out of places. Like, I won't chance it if I feel like they aren't willing to accommodate my needs. And that's fine. I'd rather go hungry than have debilitating joint pain for 3 days. But yeah, so it is very hard. You have to ask a lot of the right questions. You have to, make sure you have to double check all the time. So it is very challenging and it is very debilitating if I do get gluten or cross contaminated. Or like one time I was at a restaurant in Salt Lake and I told him I was gluten-free. I was celiac. He showed me all the gluten-free options on the menu. And then he's like, oh yeah, we have gluten-free bread. I'm like, awesome, because it's not very common. You get gluten-free bread at a restaurant. So he brings it on a plate and I said, this is the gluten-free bread. He said, yes, this is the gluten-free bread. So I ate a bite. And I have been gluten-free for 8 years now. So gluten tastes like weird to me, like almost like bad. Like if you ate something that wasn't quite right in the refrigerator. And I took a bite and he came back and I said, this is the gluten-free bread, right? And the look on his face told me it wasn't the gluten-free bread. And I was sick for a week. So
wow.
Yeah.
So
and that was just from that one bite of bread.
Well, so it seems that you run into a situation that, I'll be honest, am guilty of this, where I put gluten-free in the same category as vegetarian or vegan or kosher, where, it's just a choice. It's just, it's a diet, it's a fad, it's just something you choose. But that obviously is not the case. So it seems that there's a lot of educating that you have to do to people in order to just simply be able to eat.
Yes. Yeah. So that's actually I'm glad you brought that up because some people do gluten-free because it's a fad diet. And then there's some people like me who clearly have like medical repercussions who were doing it because it's like the way we want to live if we don't want to, get a horrible cancer or, you don't want to be sick on a daily basis and you don't want to be disabled. So like, honestly, if I did eat gluten, I would be in bed all day. Like I would be disabled because it really just knocks me out. But yeah, so I do have to educate people. Like, for example, I was in, Victoria, Canada at the spaghetti factory and they are known for their gluten-free pasta. And so I ordered this dish and I ordered a salad and he brought it out and it had the croutons on it. And I had told him before, I always tell people it's celiac, it's medical. Like I will get really sick if I eat gluten so that they know I'm not doing it for a fad diet. And I told him, I said, oh, when you bring this, can you bring this back? But you have to remake it. They can't just take the croutons off because the crumbs on the salad will make me really sick. And he goes, oh, I'm glad you told me that. He goes, because we get people coming here all the time. They say they're gluten-free. We give them a salad with croutons and they're like, oh, no big deal. I can eat it. And so those are the people who really mess it up for the rest of us who actually do it for medical reasons.
Yeah. Well, this is why I'm glad we're doing this because, again, people like me, and I'll say that because I know that I have been guilty of that. And, that's wrong of us to do. especially when it's a medical situation.
Well, and a lot of people don't know, because unless you're really in it or you have a family member or a friend that you're with that has it, it's really hard to know the difference. And while vegan and vegetarianism are a great lifestyle choice, like if I was vegetarian and I ate a piece of bacon, like I wouldn't be sick for 10 days. So for us, the people who eat gluten free because of medical reasons, it is a lifestyle, but it's not a lifestyle choice like vegan or vegetarianism.
So let's kind of go back and let me kind of get a perspective here. So without telling our ages,
which we are the same age, we'll just say we're very mature.
Yes. So you have now been gluten-free for 8 years. So this did not happen, while you were a teenager. So no. You've lived a good part of your life, like the rest of us, just eating normal and being normal. So what was that transition like in terms of, what kind of changes did you really have to go through mentally to, begin to live this gluten-free life?
Yeah. So I grew up in a very Italian family where we eat lots of bread and pasta and drank wine. And so I cried for like a day because I thought I would never be able to eat bread again, because like if I can't eat bread, I'm going to surely die, because my genes, my DNA will unravel into a small puddle of gelatin.
And your family will disown you. And
my family like, you cannot be a part of this Italian family and not eat bread.
You must eat the bread.
You must eat the bread while they squeeze your cheeks and give you wine. So anyway, so then once I figured out I couldn't eat gluten, I started looking for like the gluten-free options. And luckily 8 years ago, they started coming out with some decent options. And also I love to bake. Like I didn't grow up, like my mother never taught me how to bake, but my grandmother did. And so I love to bake and make my own things. So I was like, okay, I can figure this out. Like, how do I make my own gluten-free bread? How do I make my own gluten-free pancakes and waffles and whatever? So it was very much a challenge for me to figure out, how do I make all the things I love, to be gluten-free and be able to eat those. And so that's when I started looking for other things and looking for like, what kind of flours can I use? Now, cooking and baking gluten-free is much different than cooking with wheat or gluten-based products, because the gluten protein is very sticky and it holds things together. And that's the trick with making things gluten-free, is you have to figure out how to give it that same consistency and texture without the gluten.
So when you say stick together, so like when we get regular pieces of bread, obviously they don't fall apart when you take them out of the package, or cakes or anything like that. So removing the gluten, you can't make bread?
You can make bread, but and depending on the flour, some flours are more dry than others. Like almond and coconut flours are really dry. That's why it's really hard to get a good moist keto product, because those flours that are typically high in protein and fat are very low in moisture. And so you can do, like, rice flour is really popular to use in gluten-free things, except that I recently found out last year I can't do things that rice flour is a major ingredient, because the amount of starch bothers me as well. And so, and also too, if you're eating a lot of prepackaged foods with rice flour, they're very low in nutrition. So you're not getting good nutrition from necessarily eating gluten-free, because a lot of those prepackaged gluten-free products, they have their main ingredient is rice flour, which doesn't have a lot of vitamins in it. So you have to be really careful when you have celiac disease, because there's certain vitamins you can be very deficient in when you have celiac disease and you're eating a gluten-free diet.
So this all sounds like a lot of work, just to be honest.
But it's better than being disabled. True. So let me ask about like your family and your friends and stuff. How, I'm assuming, were you married at the time? Yes.
Okay. Was there an adjustment for your spouse and your family on all of this?
Actually, wait, was I married at the time? I think I was in between being married at the time. So yeah. So with like my family, so my daughter was 16 at the time, and she found out she had celiac disease and rheumatoid arthritis, because we found out that she had it because her knee swelled up really bad. And we did all this testing, and I took her to a pediatric rheumatologist, and I was like, it's got to be something she's eating, because it's not infection, it's not injury, it's not like whatever we checked off the list. And her celiac disease, when they tested her on the old scale of 0 to 15, was 124. So she was like way off the charts as far as having celiac disease. disease and all the side effects from it. She also had rheumatoid arthritis, which is why her knee swelled up so bad, and she still has it. And then she recently also got diagnosed with lupus, because once you have one autoimmune disease, it's very easy to get another one. So she's 22. Well, she actually just turned 23 last week, but she has 3 autoimmune diseases: rheumatoid arthritis, celiac, and lupus. And so the major changes for us and our family were that, like, at home, I actually just ordered a bread box from Amazon, so my husband can keep all of his like gluten products in, like the bread stuff, in that one bread box, because the more contained you can keep it, the better off you are. Like, I would love to go completely gluten free, but that means my husband couldn't eat like wheat thins and all that stuff that he enjoys at home. But when we go out to eat, a lot of times he'll order like a celiac safe dish so that we can share our food. Because like if he orders something that's not gluten free, he can't even put his fork on my plate. Like if we want to share food, I basically like take my plate, put whatever it is on the end of my plate and shove it off with my fork onto his plate.
Wow.
I can't touch my fork on his plate either. So there definitely is adjustments. Like I wipe down the countertops a lot more because we do have gluten in the house. You have to be really careful when you're cooking, not to cook. Like a lot of times if I just make eggs, I'll just reuse that pan for lunch or whatever, but you have to be really careful. So like my husband cooks something, we have to just immediately put the pan in the sink because we can't reuse that for anything else or recook on that, because then all of that gluten from that pan will get transferred to us, my daughter and I. And so, one of the things that is a false belief that people have about gluten is that if you cook it, it will burn off, which is completely not true. When you heat gluten, it actually becomes more sticky, and like fried gluten, it actually makes me the sickest. Like if I eat fried gluten within 45 minutes, I am like horribly ill. So there's been a lot of changes in the household. And then when we go out to eat, we use the Find Me Gluten Free app, or we eat at a place that can clearly serve me safe food. And then if that place doesn't work, we have to find another place. So it is harder eating out for sure, and traveling. I have to really plan ahead when I'm traveling or eating out to find a good, safe place, that I can eat at that won't make me sick. And even with all that, I still get cross-contaminated.
I was going to say, I mean, just in those short couple of minutes, I've got like 10 questions that popped up. So one of which is, would stick with the cooking aspect first. So my first thought is you have to have, 2 sets of stuff to, cook gluten food, and then a set to cook gluten-free food. But what about things like the oven? Like, can you share the oven?
Yeah. So we actually have one set of things that we cook with, but we have anything that's wooden in our house, we don't put any gluten on because the wood is absorbent. And we wash things off really good. Like something comes out of the dishwasher and it does not look completely clean, I'll either hand wash it or put it through the dishwasher again. So I just make sure everything is really well cleaned. And so with making a lot of meals, we make all our meals gluten free. So we don't have a lot of like gluten in the house as far as cooking it. Like when I go on vacation and I'm staying in an air, I'll take tin foil and I'll put it over like a cookie sheet, or I'll wash the cookie sheet really good and then put tin foil down and then cook something on top of it. Same thing with barbecue grills. If I'm going out to a public barbecue grill, we wrap my stuff and Aaliyah's stuff in aluminum foil, cook it on the grill wrapped in aluminum foil so that it's not touching anything else, because people put buns and stuff on the grill. So we have to be really careful about barbecue grills and shared things, like especially when I travel and I'm at an air or a hotel that has a kitchen. So I have to be really careful with all of that and make sure my food is always covered or protected from being cross-contaminated from anything else that could have been there before.
All right. Well, I'm going to skip a couple of other questions because I wanted to go back to the fact that your daughter was diagnosed as well. And it sounds like, in terms of the age range, she got diagnosed after you.
We actually got diagnosed around the same time. So I think she may have been 15, but we got diagnosed around the same time. We figured it out. But yeah, so she got diagnosed. So when we both figured out we had celiac disease was the time when I was going through a divorce with her dad. So that was the really stressful life event that triggered the autoimmune gene. So had I not had such a stressful time in my life at that point, neither of us may have even gotten celiac disease. So without that trigger, we probably wouldn't have had it.
All right. So autoimmune, we know has, some genetic traces in it and stuff like that. So is this a genetic thing that can be passed on? Or I know you said earlier that, most of us have some sort of, I don't want to say some form of celiac disease, but I mean,
gluten intolerance. Yeah.
Gluten intolerance. Okay. But in terms of the triggers and in terms of what actually brings it out, is that a, genetic thing that happens, or is it all environmental? Is it, I'm asking you like you're the doctor.
Yeah, no, I actually know a lot about this because I read a lot about it online. Because when I found out I had it, I'm like, okay, can I reverse it? And you can't, once it's turned on, you cannot reverse it, which kind of sucks. But the thing with autoimmune disease is that you have to have the gene for it. But you could carry, like I said before, you carry it your whole life and it never turns on and you never have the actual full blown disease, but you can still pass that gene on to your children. So like I have my 2 biological children. My one daughter's 26. My other daughter's 23. My 26-year-old does not have any signs or symptoms of having celiac disease. So she may still have the gene, but it's not expressing itself. Or she doesn't have the gene at all. So she may have skipped her. But we won't know until we may not ever know unless she gets genetically tested. And so that's that's a couple possibilities. So you have to have the gene that's passed down from somebody and you have to have an environmental trigger to turn it on. And that's how it works. But once it's turned on, you can't turn it off. You just have to manage it with diet and exercise and supplements.
Wow.
Oh, and going back to the gluten thing, there's a statistic I've seen in several different places, that 25% of Americans have some form of gastrointestinal issues where they have to cut gluten out of their diet. So that can mean either like an autoimmune disease like celiac disease, and then 80% of people who have an autoimmune disease that's not celiac, such as lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, the diabetes that's autoimmune related, actually benefit from not eating gluten as well, because even though they're not celiac, gluten protein is inflammatory for people with autoimmune disease. But then there's gluten intolerance, and that's basically like if you eat gluten, like eat it directly, you get a stomach ache, but you don't get cross-contaminated. Like somebody who's gluten intolerant could eat fries out of a shared fryer. I can't do that. If I ate fries out of a shared fryer, I'd be horribly sick. But if somebody's gluten intolerant, they can eat fries out of a shared fryer, but they just can't directly like eat a piece of bread or eat a piece of regular pasta.
Wow. That is a lot to keep track of, a lot to
It is. I can
research.
Send you a checklist at the end of the podcast.
Well, speaking of checklists, why don't we use that as a transition to say that this is only part 1 of our show. We're going to actually go ahead and end off here and come back with a part 2. With that, Elikqitie, let's go ahead and end off part 1, and we'll say goodnight to everybody that is listening by audio. And folks, we'll see you again here in part 2.